I'm Jennifer Lavasser, a curator here in our Department of Space History. And it's my special pleasure to get to welcome one of our current astronauts to the stage. I want to ask you that throughout the program, please feel free to come up to our microphones to ask questions if you have them. This is meant to be a very interactive program. We want you to participate and find out what it is that's burning on your mind about life in space. And so please feel free to ask questions. We have a row of seats in the back where you can go and queue up to participate in the Q&A. And we'll, of course, give you a lot of opportunity to do that because this is meant to be for you, for your information and your enjoyment. Today, we welcome astronaut Jeff Williams to the museum. Jeff is a native of northern Wisconsin. He has an engineering degree from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and is a colonel in the U.S. Army. And he joined NASA as part of the largest class of astronauts in 1996. All astronaut classes have a fun nickname, and the nickname of this class, I think, had 44 members in, is the Sardines. It was the largest class of astronauts ever. Jeff is a veteran of 4 space missions, 1 on the Space Shuttle in 2000, and 3 to the International Space Station on Soyuz rockets over the course of the last 11 years or so. We'll talk to Jeff about those flights in a little while. I want to mention, too, that Jeff is also the current record holder for days in space, 534 days. That's about a year and a half's worth of time circuiting the Earth, and so quite an interesting feat to record to hold. I want to have all of you join me in welcoming Jeff Williams to our program.
Thank you.
So I mentioned that you have been to space 4 times, all of which to the International Space Station, right?
That's right. First time was in 2000, as you said, May of 2000 on the Space Shuttle Atlantis. It was a 10-day flight very early in the assembly of the space station. There were only 2 modules there, one Russian module, Russian-built module, and one U.S. module that had been delivered by the Space Shuttle Discovery. It was before Expedition 1 arrived at the space station, before we had autonomous life support on the space station, so very early in the assembly. After that, I began training for what we call expeditions or expeditionary cruise to the space station, which especially in the earlier days meant that we spent about half our time in Russia training. And I prepared for almost 4 years for the second flight, which was on Expedition 13, in 2006, when the space station was about halfway assembled. It was also during the time that the space shuttle was grounded due to the Columbia accident, as we addressed the issues that caused the loss of that crew and the loss of the vehicle. And of course, it was a time when we were no longer, when we were not continuing with the assembly of the space station. So it was a very critical part of the history of the space station when it was about, as I said, halfway assembled.
Yeah. So to imagine over the course of it's about 16, 17 years now, you've seen the space station change quite a bit. Obviously, it's grown a lot bigger. What kinds of things about astronaut life or work on the space station have changed? You saw it at the very beginning. You've seen it very recently. You just returned in September from the space station. So how has what you do up in space changed?
Well, the early years, of course, were focused on the assembly of the space station. And when, of course, we went through those years when the space shuttle was grounded. And in that time, while we fixed that problem, we were maintaining the space station and still doing science and research. Started doing science and research early on in the program. But the primary purpose, of course, was assembly. The assembly was finished in 2011, essentially. I had a visit there in 09 and 10, and it was right at the end of, towards the end of the assembly when we were putting up the last major components. There was another component added shortly after that. After that, though, we transitioned into what we call the utilization phase of the space station, where it's a full up, it's very big, it's a laboratory, and we're doing the science and research and technology development that will support lots of disciplines of science as well as future exploration of space.
Well, I think a lot of the people in our audience probably think space is obviously a really exciting place to be, but I would imagine being on the space station is not exactly easy all the time either. So what things are tell our audience a little bit about what things are more difficult because you're in space.
Well, one, you're isolated off the planet and isolated somewhat, although right now we're a crew of 6, and I've been on crews of 2, 3, 5, and 6, different sizes, but the crew of 6 is the current size. So we have plenty of company on board, and we have good connectivity with the ground, friends and family on the ground, but still we're isolated up there. In 6 months is a long time, as you can imagine. But it's a very busy place. People ask if I get bored up there, and boredom is not in the vocabulary that describes it. We're very, very busy. It's a very aggressive work schedule. We work on a 24-hour day and a 7-day work week, where Sundays we try to have that mostly free when able.
I was going to ask about scheduling of work. I understand you keep pretty strict schedules. How is that like or not like what we go through here on Earth, where we've got our iPhones that have our schedule for the whole day? I mean, are you kind of regularly checking a schedule and kind of having to keep a really tight schedule, basically?
We have ground teams in the mission control centers. The lead mission control center, of course, is in Houston, and we also have a control center in Huntsville, Alabama, as well as the international partners control centers in Munich, Germany, Tsukuba, Japan, and Moscow, Russia. And they're all integrated, and they do the planning. They do the long-range planning. They do the planning for next week, for example, and then they do the daily refining of a plan. So when we're sleeping overnight, we wake up to the final plan for that day, and every crew member has every minute scheduled for the day.
Wow.
And they've got all the details of what it takes to execute a particular task, like where everything is stowed on the space station. It is it's your worst case closet, if you will. So finding things can be a challenge, so we spend a lot of time keeping stuff organized, and then of course the procedures to execute each task. So we have a huge team on the ground that works all those details out.
And it's a big physical challenge being in space too. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the things that make it maybe a little bit easier to deal with, as far as how do you keep up your exercise, and what are the sort of I guess ways that you maybe keep things really light and entertaining, because it can't all be work, I would imagine.
No, it's not all work. I mean, I've been on orbit, I think if I count all the missions and the visiting shuttle crews on some long duration flights, I think I've been on orbit with 50 different people.
Wow.
From, I don't even know how many countries, I'd have to go look them up, but many different countries. And every crew combination has been just a joy to be with and to work with. So we have a lot of fun. There's a little bit of humor that usually goes on in the background, but we're all predominantly seriously focused on the mission and accomplishing our mission for our particular crew in great detail.
And we can see one of the light moments in a photo here. Looks like you celebrated Christmas there.
That's
even.
right. When you're there for 6 months, you go through major events that we all experience on the ground, and Christmas obviously was one of those examples.
Great. So when we get visitors here at the museum, people often ask, what's life like in space? What's different from being on the ground? What are some of the basic things that really physically are experienced differently? What are the sort of, we've heard lots of stories about sleeping being a little different, about eating obviously being different. How long does it take? Has it been easier to adjust to that over time?
Going there, every mission gets easier to adjust. In fact, the last time I launched about a year ago and arrived to the space station a few hours later, and it was almost as if I never left. There was really no adaptation to speak of. So we learn, our bodies learn, our bodies adapt. The first time it was a little bit more challenging, of course. Second time a little less challenging, and then very easy this last time. But the obvious difference would be the weightless environment and living and working and managing life with everything floating around, and we lose things all the time, but thankfully it's in an enclosed space, so eventually you find everything. So that's the basic challenge with it.
So just like a messy bedroom for a kid, eventually you might find that sock that you left behind one day.
Yes, except the mess keeps moving around. So
there was a photo that we just showed of some things that come from home. What kinds of things did you take with you to remind you of home? I know we talk a lot about, I like to talk a lot about how food has a psychological effect. Having fresh food and having meals together has a good positive psychological effect. But what kinds of things did you take with you to remind you of home, other than just obviously maybe comfort food that you might get to eat?
Yeah, well, we can, on our person, in the Soyuz, we can only take a very small amount. It's about 1.5 kilograms, 3 or 4 pounds, well, 5 pounds or so. No less than that. So it's small stuff, but it's family photography and maybe a few knickknacks and stuff. I took some things for my 4 grandchildren as souvenirs later. And you kind of, each crew member has a crew quarters on board, so you might put some of those photos up there, make that sort of your private place and with the personal connection. But food, as you mentioned, is also very important. And we have the standard space food, which is very good, and it's a wide variety of different types of food, but we also have crew care packages, we call, and that might be special foods like being displayed. One of the real big treats is when a cargo vehicle arrives. The ground crews have typically put fresh fruits and vegetables on board, and when you're up there for months, you don't get that. So, and you have to eat it pretty quick because we don't have a lot of refrigeration on board.
Yeah.
So.
I noticed a lot of pictures of you with apples, so I'd imagine you're an apple fan.
Oh yeah, like apples, and apples last. They have a pretty good shelf life, so they might last a couple weeks.
That's great. So you've got this, really difficult schedule, and you're away from home. What are the kinds of things that that you as a crew or you as a sort of just on your own have done to kind of stay connected with the ground? Not only sort of having that memorabilia, but those things from home as touchstones. What ways are you able to interact with the ground basically, or your families?
NASA and the International Partnership has done a great job to keep us connected with the family and to support the family also while we're away. Obviously, we're not there to deal with the things that we all have to deal with. So, and part of that support is being able to communicate, of course. So, for example, I think my wife and I talked every day, at least twice a day. I'd call her after I knew she was awake, and then I'd call her again before our sleep time, and we work on Greenwich Mean Time, so you got that 5 or 6 hour time change. And once a week, usually on a Sunday afternoon for us, we would have a video teleconference with the family. So email, we have a limited connectivity on the internet, so we can, of course, many people are aware of social media. We usually have a social media campaign, which enables us to communicate to the world what we're doing. We don't necessarily have a lot of opportunity for the reverse.
Sure. And we should mention, we were showing your Twitter page here, that you actually participated in NASA's very first live from space Twitter event. So we could talk a little bit more about this later, but what's important about sharing that with the world? I mean, Twitter is accessible to everybody with an account, basically. So what's the importance of that to you?
Well, we all realize that spaceflight is fascinating to virtually everybody, and there's a big interest in it, and we appreciate the interest. The best way that you can, what I say, vicariously take everybody to that vantage point and experience it is through photography and video. So my passion very early on, even in my first flight, came to trying to capture as much as I could, especially visual imagery, to again, as I say, bring the folks on the ground to that vantage point and be able to view it, especially the viewing the Earth from there. You never get tired of that.
I would imagine not. Well, we're going to switch over to something else. We're going to, you're going to show us a video right now, and Jeff's going to talk over the video and explain a little bit of it to us as we go along. So let's get started.
All right, this is a video that documents my last flight, which, as I mentioned, I launched about a year ago, and it was a 6-month flight, expedition, my third long-duration flight on the space station. And as you know, we're launching and landing with our Russian partners on Soyuz rockets and spacecraft from Kazakhstan, Baikonur, Kazakhstan, which is their equivalent to Kennedy Space Center. And here in these video scenes, you see our launch day where we've gotten suited up in the suits and taken out to the launch pad. And here's a final wave at the base of the rocket before we get into the 4 of us, 3 crew members and 1 technician, into this 2-man elevator, squeezed in there and take the ride to the top of the rocket. That was a joke. You can laugh. Take a ride to the top of the rocket and then climb into the capsule, which you see here. You see 2 out of the 3 of us, and then the 3rd crew member. I flew this time up on the Soyuz with 2 Russian cosmonauts. When we get strapped in there about 2.5 hours before launch, it's as if we're triplets in a womb. Very tight spot. We go through the launch countdown, which it takes about 2.5 hours after we strap in. Get to that very precise moment necessary to launch so that later we can rendezvous and dock with the International Space Station and then lift off. Obviously, this is a very big moment, a very key moment to begin the mission. We feel about 4 times the force of gravity in the ascent, so if I weigh 200 pounds, you feel like 800 pounds in that rocket. After less than 9 minutes, you're going orbital velocity, which is 17,500 miles an hour. We spent the next several hours completing the rendezvous with the space station, and here you see what the space station looked like shortly before our docking, and this is the final moments of docking. Again, it's very incredible to go 17,500 miles an hour and dock with another orbiting spacecraft that precise. After doing the pressure checks of the 2 vehicles, the docking interface, we opened the hatches, and we were welcomed on board by Tim Cooper there, Tim, who's an American, Tim Peake from Great Britain, and Yuri Malenchiko from Russia, and we became the entire crew of Expedition 47. The inside of the space station is huge. It's about the size, the volume of a 5,000 square foot house. And here's just a couple of clips of what it looks like. Living and working there, it has all the elements of life on the ground, to include meals. We work a 24-hour day, and we try to get together often for dinner as a crew of 6. You can see just in a weightless environment, it's a very unique place to live and work, and of course it has a lot of the obvious rewards that you might imagine. We got off to a very busy start. About a week after we arrived, we had a cargo ship also launched from Baikonur, Kazakhstan, and then docked with the International Space Station, bringing up a little over 5,000 pounds of supplies and equipment for us. That was the first of 3 cargo ships that arrived in the first 3 weeks that I was there this last time. We had the Russian cargo ship as well as this one, which is a Cygnus Orbital Sciences spacecraft that also brought a little over 5,000 pounds of supplies and equipment. This one was launched from Florida, from Kennedy Space Center. And then about a week after that, we had a SpaceX Dragon launch and rendezvous with the space station. So it was a very busy first 3 weeks of our stay. And of course, bringing up those supplies and equipment is very critical. There was one very unique piece of equipment that was on that Dragon, and that's what you see here being plucked out of its bay by the robotic arm and attached to the outside of the International Space Station. This is called the BEAM module, B-E-A-M. It's a Bigelow Expandable Activity Module. It's new technology, and the space station is a laboratory, but it's also a place where we can test out new technology that will support future exploration. And this expandable module is an example of that. And here you see us going through the process to expand this. This is a lot faster than what actually took place, but it's a very important experiment that's ongoing, and it will stay attached to the space station for, the plan is the next 3 years. Very likely it will stay longer than that, as again an experimental design of a module that might support either future exploration in deep space as well as on a surface of, say, the Moon or Mars. And here you see the crew of 6 with a moment of celebration as we got that module expanded and opened up. Fast forward a little bit into June of last year, it was time to end Expedition 47, and that milestone meant that Tim, and Yuri had completed their 6-month stay, and it was time for them to return to Earth and their friends and family, and for us the 3 of us, to continue to operate the space station. So we got them ready to get into their Soyuz, said our goodbyes, our farewells, basically said we'll see you in another 3 months after we get back, and then got them buttoned up into their Soyuz spacecraft. they undocked and deorbited and returned to the planet in Kazakhstan. That left 3 of us on board, as I said, myself and my 2 Russian crewmates. And it's a kind of a quiet time when you get rid of the other 3. So it's a very roomy place. And Alexei and Oleg and I stayed very busy during that 3 weeks, continuing to run the space station and doing many of the science experiments that were on our schedule. And this is Oleg and Alexei in the Russian segment doing a test actually with a docking test with that supply ship that had arrived a couple days earlier. We rotate 3 at a time. So now we've had a case in June where 3 people have left. There are 3 of us on board. In the meantime, back in Baikonur, Kazakhstan, another 3 people were preparing to launch and to join us. So now we're into early July after our 3 weeks with 3 on board, and Kate Rubins, Takuya Nishi, and Anatoly Ivanishin, an American, a Japanese, and a Russian, launched from Baikonur, Kazakhstan, and docked, in their case, 2 days after launch. So here we are welcoming them on board. And now you get the sense of the rhythm on board the ISS, the International Space Station. 4 times a year, we're rotating 3 crew members. So we have this going on every couple of months. So it's a very dynamic place. The crews are changing out all the time. A lot of people don't realize we've had continuous human presence in space since the fall of 2000. Continuous human presence. And this is the rhythm of life that's been going on since then on board the space station. Here's a very interesting experiment developed up at MIT. It's developing control systems for satellites. We have these volleyball-shaped satellites that fly around, programmed to do different maneuvers inside the modules of the space station. And it's been flying up there for many years, I think since 2006, as I recall, and has accomplished a lot of good engineering development, as well as some educational activities with students. Kate Rubins is a scientist by background, so she was involved in some new science. For the first time on board, we had live heart cells, and that's what you see there in that short video clip. At the cellular level, human heart cells actually beat, and they communicate to each other, so they beat in unison, and I found that to be just fascinating. Kate also was able to, for the first time, sequence DNA in space. So that's a new capability that we just developed last year, got on board the space station, and that has a lot of promise for the future with all the research that goes on in genetics and DNA research. So that was a very exciting milestone, and here's Kate celebrating the first sequencing of DNA. We study the human body a lot. That's one of our primary areas of study, to understand the effects of gravity and the space environment on the human body, and to develop countermeasures. And here, Alexei and I are involved in an experiment called fluid shifts, where we're trying to understand, it's a very aggressive experiment, studying lots of functions of the body and trying to isolate the effects of the space environment. It's also a joint experiment that NASA has with the Russians. The space station has several laboratory modules. It has a laboratory module that the European Space Agencies put up. It also has one that the Japanese space agencies put up. And here Takuya is showing a sequence of activity in the Japanese module. The Japanese module has a unique facility of an airlock where we can put payloads and equipment outside the space station. And that's what he's doing here. He's assembled an experiment, put it in the airlock, and then we close the inside hatch and then able to let the air out of the airlock, open the outside hatch. It slides out on a remotely controlled table, as you see here, and then grabbed by a robotic arm. And then the robotic arm is used to place it in its position, its planned position outside the space station, or in some cases, even using it to deploy satellites that are going to be, in this case, fired away from the space station. Other experiments that have a variety of different science in them, some of them basic science research, some of them educational activities that student programs have put together, gotten their small satellites on board the space station, and we deploy them from the space station, as you see here. So that's just some examples of some of the science and research that's taken place on board. Let's see, we go into July, mid-July now. We got another Dragon SpaceX vehicle, a cargo ship that arrived. And here we are in the cupola, which, by the way, is a great vantage point that enables you to see the entire globe. We also have a robotic arm control system there, and that's where we grabbed the SpaceX, got it on board the space station. And then here you see a robotic arm grabbing another key piece of equipment and a major milestone in the life of the space station, which required us to go outside to fully integrate onto the space station. And what that key hardware was is called the International Docking Adapter. So we used the robotic arm to put it in its place at the very front end of the space station, and then Kate Rubins and I went outside and executed about a 6.5-hour spacewalk to integrate it on the front end of the space station. It will be used as the docking adapter for the commercial crewed vehicles that are currently being developed and hopefully will fly in the next couple of years, one being developed by SpaceX, the other one being developed by Boeing. Doing a spacewalk is physically the hardest thing we do up there, working in these suits and having to have yourself tethered 100% of the time on a safety tether, and all of the tools and equipment that we use to work out also has to be tethered 100% of the time because you would lose things otherwise. But we celebrated a very successful first spacewalk, and that set us up then to go out 2 weeks later and do another spacewalk. And this one had the primary objective of retracting a thermal radiator that had been deployed for several years, this accordion-shaped thing deployed out of the back of the truss segment. And then we did a variety of other things to include some repairs as well as some installation of the first exterior high-definition cameras. Takuya, in this case, was on the inside operating the robotic arm, and I got on the end of the arm, and he drove me around to the places that we needed to install those two high-definition cameras. But for the first time, starting last September, now we're getting HD photography and video from the exterior of the ISS. And exterior photography is very critical. We've taken lots of pictures from inside through the windows, and here you see some a view, a vantage point of going to what we call the cupola. I mentioned it earlier. It is, I call it the window on the world. There are 6 radial windows and 1 center window there, and it's pointed toward the Earth, so it's the one place on the space station where you can see the entire globe of the Earth from a single vantage point. For most of us, what quickly becomes our passion is to take photography, take pictures of the Earth, and that certainly was my passion. They credit me with about 450,000 pictures of the Earth over my flights. So I spent all my free time practically taking it. And here you see some examples of the wonder of the details. Here's Central Valley, for example, in California, from the vantage point of the International Space Station. The Straits of Hormuz in Iran. The Bahamas, beautiful reefs in the Bahamas. There you see a close-up of those reefs. If you've been there, you know they're beautiful. They're also beautiful from orbit. Here, ice flows off the coast of Canada in the Atlantic Ocean. Agricultural irrigation circles there. The Patagonia region in the southern tip of South America and the glaciers down there, absolutely beautiful, the most beautiful glaciers in the world. The Great Salt Desert in eastern Iran, and these salt domes are what they called, a very unique geologic formation. Or this or just after sunset, close-up of the horizon, hurricane. The Denali Range in Alaska, an oblique view of that. The Grand Canyon, close up here with the Colorado River on the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The Tetons, Jackson Hole, if you've been there. A very unique view of what we call noctilucent clouds, which we periodically see over the North and South Pole. Very unique, very mysterious, very beautiful. Those are just some examples of what you can see from that vantage point. And of course, there's an endless assortment available on the internet.
And I relinquish the command to Anatoly.
At the NASA website. That takes us to the point, early September.
Congratulations.
It was the end of our stay on board. So again, another change of command. So I handed over command to Anatoly here, as you saw.
We really enjoyed the time we spent together at Expedition 48 on International Space Station.
Obviously, from a crew point of view, that's a major milestone. We're getting to the end. We're getting ready to go home, return to the planet. So Alexei, Oleg, and I were very excited that day. Of course, we were saying goodbye to our friends, leaving them on board, and then getting prepared to get in the Soyuz spacecraft, strap into those seats again, back into that small descent module, and then get the spacecraft prepared to undock and return to Earth. The time from undocking to touching down on the ground is about 3 hours and 15 or 20 minutes. So it happens very fast. We undock here, and here you see the moment of separation from the space station. Separate from the space station. A couple hours later, do a deorbit burn over the southern tip of South America, and then re-enter the atmosphere, literally going through a fireball, and again feeling about 4 times the force of gravity for about 10 minutes. After we go through that phase, the parachute opens, which is a critical phase of the mission. Takes about 25 seconds for that sequence to complete, which is the longest 25 seconds of your life. But it opens up. The search and rescue forces had us spotted immediately after the parachute opening, circled us down as we got to the ground, and had us out of the capsule within 30 minutes or so. And here you see some of those scenes as they pulled us out, and we returned to what I call the relentless force of gravity, which we had not experienced for 6 months. Spent a little bit of time there getting our land legs back, then took a helicopter ride back to an airfield of about 2.5 hours, where NASA had this airplane waiting with a crew. We had a couple of doctors and the flight crew, of course, for the airplane. And I was back landing in Houston 24 hours after landing in Kazakhstan. Wow. The day before. So greeted by, of course, my family and friends and coworkers. So that completed this final stay, this last stay of last year on this magnificent facility we call the International Space Station. Now I know, Jennifer, we're going to get into some Q&A, but before we do, so we don't run out of time, I appreciate the opportunity to come here to the Air and Space Museum and here in Washington, D.C., and have another opportunity to tell the story of this program we call the International Space Station. As a memento of my appreciation for the support that the Smithsonian and the Air and Space Museum gives to us, I would like to leave this montage for you, which has a few pictures from Expedition 47 and 48 to include the launch on that Soyuz rocket, a clip from or a frame from a GoPro video that we put in the Soyuz window on the approach to the space station, a view of Kate and I going out the door during our second spacewalk of this flight, and then of course the descent under parachute, and in the background you see that magnificent view of the setting sun and the layers of the horizon with all the beautiful colors of oranges, blues, and yellows. So thank you for your...
Thank you. This is fantastic. We really appreciate it. Well, let's do just that. Let's get to some questions. I'm sure a few of you in the audience must have a burning question on your mind for Jeff, so go ahead and step up.
Mr. Williams, we see a lot of the scientific work that goes on at the space station, but I had a more philosophical, if you will, question. For those of us who have never been outside of the Earth's atmosphere, maybe you could describe your first time or just how it changes your perspective looking back on the Earth.
That's a big question with a full answer, obviously. But it impacts everybody for obvious reasons going there. And I would say that in many different ways, but perhaps the biggest way, the broadest way, is viewing the planet that we call home of Earth and seeing the details of the Earth. And especially, it gives you a special appreciation for how the Earth is provisioned, if you will, all of the things necessary to support us, support our living on the planet, to include the atmosphere and the water cycle and the provision that comes out of the Earth itself. You know, I showed a picture there in the video of the agriculture. So you see that. You see mines up there. So and it reminds you that everything that we have, the buildings that we're in, the cars that we drive, the things in our pocket, our smartphones or whatnot, come from the resources of the earth and, of course, mankind's know-how and the development of technology. So that's, for me, that's probably, in a short answer, the most profound aspect of the experience, and growing an appreciation of all that.
Thank you.
Two questions. One, tell me about the quarantine. Is there a quarantine, I'm assuming, when you get back? And just the difference on what it feels like, you know, without gravity, and then how long does it take you the very first time when you got back on ground? I mean, I know it got better over time.
Yeah, quarantine, we no longer have quarantine when we return, per se. That was executed in the Apollo program because we didn't know what the crews were going to be bringing back from the moon itself. We do get some kind of isolation. We need a little bit of time and a little bit of protection from the public, I guess, for a while as we rehabilitate ourselves, and we do go through a rehabilitation. We do have quarantine, though, pre-flight, and that's very important. And it's generally, for space shuttle crews, it was typically 10 days. Over in Kazakhstan, it ends up being about 12 days or so, and that's to ensure that we don't take any kind of bugs to space and infect the crew that's already up there. And thankfully, in my entire experience, we never had any colds or flus or that kind of thing, you know, virus or bacterial kinds of ailments, so the quarantine has worked. Adaptation, there's an adaptation going there that I would say maybe roughly half the population goes through a period of illness, you might say related to motion sickness, but everybody gets over that within a couple of days. Thankfully, I didn't suffer that, but probably the most significant adaptation is the return to gravity. Think about it, our vestibular system relies on gravity, so that drives our sense of balance. So when you first get back, your brain takes a while to reintegrate the inner ear and the vestibular system in the sense of balance. So you have no sense of balance outside your visual cues when you first get back. That improves very rapidly in the first few hours even, and certainly the first couple of days. But I experienced what I call a vestibular awareness for about a week or 10 days each flight after landing. The second area that you have to rehabilitate yourself or recondition yourself has to do with your muscles. Even though we exercise every day up there with both aerobic, running on a treadmill or a cycle, and the equivalent of weightlifting using a resistive exercise device, we still have muscles that we can't isolate up there. And that can take about 6 weeks to get over the soreness and get back into feeling, 95% back recovered. The third area that we recover from is bone loss. Bone loss is suffered because our bones need loading and exercise too. And if you're in a weightless environment, the density of the calcium in our bones will diminish over time. Exercise does a very good job of countering that, and we've become more effective in our exercise protocols on board, so that this last flight, whereas previously I did suffer, I would say, in-family measurable bone loss, this last flight, so far the data shows that I didn't suffer. It was negligible anyway. We still have some more data that is being collected and will be researched. But those are the areas of recovery. Great questions.
This other one's really quick. How does someone vote from space?
How does someone
Vote for president?
Vote? Contact your representative and express your view. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to know, what kind of training do you go through to be able to go into space?
Training that's a very good question. Training is very broad in scope. There are many subjects. The obvious things are we train how to operate the space station. We train how to operate, in the old days, the space shuttle or the Russian Soyuz. We train how to do spacewalks. We train how to run the robotic arms. Some of in all the experiments that I talked about, some of the things that are maybe not so obvious is in our homes. If something goes wrong in our home, the refrigerator breaks or whatnot, we call the repairman. The AC goes out, we call the repairman, the electrician, the plumber or whatnot. We can't do that up there, so we get trained in all those areas as well. We have to be able to repair anything that breaks, and we're prepared to do that. We have to be prepared for emergencies up there. We can call the fire department, call 911 here on the ground. We have to be prepared to respond to that, and obviously we have our own category of emergencies up there, like a depressurization, which would be very bad to deal with. Another area, if you get sick or you get injured, you can go to the doctor. We can't do that, so many of us train, not everybody on the crew, but the majority of us do medical training. So we go through the equivalent of an EMT training, and we also spend time in trauma centers and operating rooms, so for hands-on. So you never know. You go to the emergency room, you might be treated by an astronaut, at least in Houston one day, and not even know it. So those are just some examples. Probably people ask me, what is the hardest training I've gone through? And none of those items by themselves is difficult, but the scope of the training over many years is the biggest challenge, because the scope is very large. But if you were to ask me what is the single hardest thing that's been for me, it would be the Russian language. And we use Russian and English on board. So нужно говорить по-русски. It is necessary to speak Russian for those of us that are not from Russia. So that's been the biggest challenge. It also brings the greatest rewards, though.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. We'll have one more question, and I'm going to have a few of my own, I think.
Okay.
I have a question about the aesthetics inside the International Space Station. I did not see very much color, and I saw a lot of cords and wires and boxes. It's like every square inch is covered. What's it like to live in such a cluttered-looking place that's all kind of black and white? And do neat freaks kind of go crazy up there with all the clutter?
Yeah, and I tend to be one of those neat freaks. It does take a little bit of getting used to. I mentioned earlier it's your worst case closet for storage stuff. It's also your worst case, no offense teenagers, but teenage bedroom, in terms of clutter and whatnot. And we're always adding things to the inside of the modules, deploying things, and that's where all those cables that you see there, deploying those new boxes, new electronics, new experiments or whatnot that's on board. So we're always working continually to try to keep the place ship-shape and organized, but it is a challenge. In terms of aesthetics, the best place to get relief from that, if of course your personal crew quarters, you can keep a little bit more organized and have personal pictures and whatnot up there to detract from the clutter, if you will. But the best place to go is the cupola or another window and view the Earth. That's the greatest source to counter that.
And just a quick follow-up question. When you were saying goodbye and entering the Soyuz capsule, you were in regular clothes, but when you landed, you were in the spacesuit. So at what point in the journey home do you put on the spacesuit, and is there room to do that inside the Soyuz?
Oh, yeah, there is. There's what we call a habitation module, which is a small module that will be thrown away and burns up in the atmosphere. So what you saw in the video clip, I think I was wearing just regular pants and a long sleeve t-shirt. The long sleeve t-shirt was basically long underwear that we wear underneath the spacesuit. And I also had long bottoms on under the pants. When we got into the Soyuz, closed the hatch, I took the pants off and stowed them in the corner, and they were going to get thrown away. And then our spacesuits were stowed inside that habitation module. So the first thing that we were doing after we did the wave on the camera and said goodbye to the crew is close the hatch and then get into those spacesuits. And that's a process that takes 20 or 30 minutes or so. And after we're strapped up in the spacesuits, and by the way, there's an example of one right over here on the display of a Sokol spacesuit. Then we get strapped into the seats and we're on our way.
Well, I'm going to ask a question that some of our young people might want to, or might be thinking about right now. And typically we ask this at the beginning, but I'm going to ask it at the end. What inspired you to become an astronaut? And particularly, what would you say to people who are interested in working in the space program, but maybe being an astronaut isn't their thing?
Yeah, there are many things I think I could claim to be part of the inspiration along the way. Certainly my father was an inspiration. He was a school teacher and a guidance counselor during the years I went through high school. So as fathers and parents typically do, you know, he was a great influence on me, and I would say a great positive influence. There was a 6th grade science teacher by the name of Don Johnson who was a particular inspiration for me and fostered an early interest in science and things related to science. When I graduated high school, I went off to the military academy at West Point, was introduced to Army aviation, and became immediately interested in becoming a pilot. During my time there, I read the book called The Right Stuff, which chronicles the early test pilots and astronauts. And that, again, strengthened my interest and passion to not only become a pilot, but an experimental test pilot and eventually an astronaut. And then opportunities opened their way over the years in my career in the Army.
Are there particular, I know a lot of kids will ask, are there particular subjects in school that one might study, or what's the sort of path maybe now, if you're not interested in being a pilot, what might be a path that kids might take towards working in space?
If you're interested in working in space, obviously math and science and later engineering types topic those are what you want to focus on. But you want to do that if that's where your interests are. You know, everybody has different interests, different callings in life, different passions that they develop, and you want to pursue your passions, and then of course work hard along the way. That's not to say the other subjects aren't important. They're very important. You know, the languages, the English, the humanities are very important. It's very important to be able to communicate no matter what we do, and we do that through those languages. A lot of folks think that the opportunities in space might be limited to astronauts because we're the most publicly visible. But there's a huge team of people out there that make spaceflight possible. Yeah. So there's lots of opportunities in NASA and related aerospace companies and organizations for engineers and scientists and technicians of all different fields and backgrounds. So great opportunities. I also would say that particularly with NASA, it is the best work environment I've ever experienced or been exposed to, in that everybody is there because they want to be part of the team and they believe in the mission. And you can see, I think perhaps you get excited just hearing this briefing and seeing the video and the photography. Imagine working in the business. There's a natural excitement that everybody has and really maintains over, in many cases, decades throughout their career.
Okay. We have more audience questions, I think. Hi there.
Hi. I was wondering, like, if you spilt something, such as water, how would you clean it up or, like, put it back in the bottle of some sort?
We spill things often up there. So what doesn't show up very well in that video I showed are the food stains on the walls of the modules on the inside. So we're always working it. Every day we're cleaning up spills or whatnot. So things will float off, drift off, and anything that's wet will stick to the first thing it touches typically. And if it's a soft material kind of thing, then it will oftentimes soak in at least partially into that material, even if it's got some kind of an liquid or liquid repellent on it. It tends to soak in. So if it's food stains, you got to wipe pretty hard, and it's pretty well stained. Water is very easy. Water will touch a surface and stay there, and you can either just grab it with a towel, wipe it off, or eventually it'll dry. Even if you put it in a towel, if you wipe it, don't put it back in the container. That's pretty hard to do, but you will put it in a towel and then just hang the towel out, clip it to something, and then eventually dries, goes into the atmosphere, and then we have the equivalent of an air conditioning system running all the time that takes the humidity out of the air, condenses it, and we use that to recycle the water that then later becomes drinking water.
Okay, thank you. Great question. Hi there.
What emotions do you feel before and after you go into space?
Very good question.
Excellent.
It's very emotional to go into space, to get ready to go in space. There's a lot of anticipation. You've been training for years and preparing for it. And you saw in the video that the ride on the rocket itself has a lot of energy and power as it boosts you up, and you feel 4 times your weight as you go up there. And then you leave the atmosphere, and the blue sky in a day launch turns black. And you know you're above the atmosphere. And then you start seeing the Earth as a globe. And then you realize you're going around the Earth every hour and a half, every 90 minutes. And you're weightless, and you're floating around. So all of that is very exciting. It's a very humbling experience, I would say. It's not scary for most of us because we are pretty prepared to go there, but it is very exciting. It's also very emotional to come back. You've been there for a long time, in my case 6 months, and to return to the Earth after successfully completing a long 6-month mission and return into the safety of the planet, if you will, and more particularly return into our friends and family, that can be very emotional as well. Great question.
And we should mention, too, that it's not just you that can see the Earth. We can also see the space station. A lot of people don't realize that.
That's right. And I encourage, how many people have seen the space station fly over? A few of you, quite a few of you. I encourage everybody to go out and do a search on the internet. You can just search ISS sightings, for example, or something like that, and find some apps or online, on the internet, websites where you can put your location on the ground in the app, and then it will look ahead over the next couple of weeks or so to see if there are opportunities to see it fly over. If you haven't seen it fly over, you need to. And then go on the internet, find out who's on board, learn a little bit about those people, and that'll give you a personal connection to this program, this Flying in Space. Again, as I said earlier, continuous presence for over 16 years now.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I was wondering if your experience in the United States Army as a colonel has helped you become an astronaut as far as physically and all the degrees you might have gotten while you were at West Point. So I'm basically just asking, how would you recommend current military members would go about, what training you'd recommend for going to and working with NASA in their future?
Absolutely. My education at West Point and my subsequent Army career certainly had a lot to do with being competitive to be selected for this job. So historically, about half the astronaut corps has been military from the different services. I don't remember the exact number, but there are about 15 or 16 historically from the Army. The numbers are greater from the Air Force and Navy, and then there's also many from the Marine Corps. So all the there's several from the Coast Guard, but that's about half of the Corps. The vast majority of those that come from the military have been pilots and experimental test pilots. So historically, that has made one at least competitive to be considered for the job. Education-wise, even though a bachelor's degree is the minimum requirement to be competitive, really need a master's degree in engineering or hard science. In more recent years, because the focus is on long-duration flight on the space station itself, the military test pilot precedent has diminished a little bit. So if, for example, I'll speak for the Army, we've had some folks recently that have been selected that come from backgrounds such as special ops or even military medical, a medical doctor who, by the way, also had experience in the special ops world. So those kinds of experiences and environments demonstrate one's potential to work in an extreme environment that's physically challenging, mentally challenging, and sometimes you have to endure long durations, right, in those kinds of businesses, especially in the combat experience that people are getting nowadays.
Thank you, sir.
And I think we have time for 2 more quick questions from our younger audience members.
Tell me about the asteroid redirect mission.
Oh, good
Well, that's
question.
a complex one for the 2 minutes we have left.
Yes, that's a big one. That's a mission to redirect the asteroid has been studied. It hasn't been developed very much, but it's been studied to try to put together the architecture for how that mission might be accomplished. And there's a couple of reasons to do that. One is we can learn more about our solar system, particularly by going out and retrieving an asteroid and bringing it a little bit closer to the Earth in what we call the lunar system, or cislunar. So it's close to the Earth, close to the Moon. It makes it accessible to be an object to study. And of course, then there's always the remote possibility, although finite possibility, of an asteroid being on a trajectory that would impact the Earth. And of course, we've seen some of the fictional movies, if you will, that have that as the plot, where you go out and redirect the asteroid. Personally, I don't know how realistic that is, but that's certainly an idea behind that mission.
Great. Thank you. All right. Great question. I wouldn't be able to go home if I didn't ask you, for my son, what's your favorite food to eat in space?
Oh my goodness, it's really hard to pin down a favorite food. I tell you what, if I picked a favorite food and I had too much of it, I would be sick of it after a while. So your favorite food ends up being something that's kind of unique that you haven't had for a while. Maybe you have a memory of that food from.
Sure.
But I'll throw one out there just for it, because it was very unique on the space station in 2009. Bob Thirsk, who's a Canadian astronaut, was on the crew, and he had some special food sent up to him, which he wasn't able to consume at all by the time he left, and I was still on board. So I discovered a special treat of smoked salmon.
Oh,
Canadian
great.
smoked salmon.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for being here today. Thank our audience for all your great questions. And thank you for participating in our What's New in Aerospace program today. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.